my daddy and his brothers were all excited over this song, and I asked them what it was, and they said, this is a song that really happened. That where we come from at the time, we had moved out to San Diego, California, and stayed for a year or so, and that's about 6 or 7, yeah, 6, I guess, and he told me his first one that I ever heard mention it. He said it happened close to where you grew up at Kings Creek over in Wilkes County. And as I grew up, we soon came home after that and stayed, and I began to peel my ear to the different people that told about Tom Dooley. And one of the most interesting versions I heard of that story was from a man named Wade Gilbert, who was once well known here in the Yadkin Valley. He lived just over in Wilkes County a little ways. He's a fiddler and a banjo picker, and he said a time or two and told me about what happened with Tom Dooley. I made a recording one time of him, and I know that, and I was introduced to him by a friend up at toward Kings Creek named Clifton Brawhill, and Clifton was the son of old man Gordon Brawhill, who was a brother to Ed that owned the furniture factory. And Cliff and his family's end of it was that they were involved in the timbering, and Cliff loved old-time music. And my mother's mom and daddy had moved down here from Mitchell County to operate a store. It was on the Broad Hills property. They lived down there. It was right beside the Blue Creek Road on 18. And anyway, Cliff loved old-time music, and he took me down to Wilkes to meet Uncle Wade Gilbert. And the story that he told was that Tom Dooley, he was supposed to have been a pretty good-looking boy. He had lots of girlfriends, and one of them that he was especially interested in was named Ann Foster, that he courted before the war between the North and the South, or as some of the old-timers in this part of the world used to call it, the war between the Democrats and the Republicans. Anyway, Tom went with Ann Foster, and he went off to war though. After it started, he was in there for I guess 2 or 3 years, and he when he come home, I guess he thought he'd still see Ann, but in the meantime she had married an older man by the name of Melton, and they lived it was in the Elk Creek community down there in that section. And so Tom would go over to visit with the Meltons. Everybody knew everybody, and was just like anywhere in this part of the world you can, either through blood or marriage or some such as that. And he'd go and he'd talk to the old man till the old man would go to sleep. And back in those times, is in other parts of the Appalachians, the old homes, the living room was also the bedroom too. And you'd have a big fireplace in there, and then you'd have the master's bed, and then they'd have tunnel beds that'd come out from under it, and maybe some other beds in the room. So whenever old man Melton would go to sleep, Laurie would slip over to Tom's side of the room and sit there and talk to him for a little while. Well, since she was tied up by marriage, he started seeing some other girls around. One of them was Ann's first cousin, and her name was Laurie Foster. She might have been a year or two younger than Ann. Laurie lived with her daddy. Her mother was dead. She had some brothers. I don't know if she had a sister or not. But they lived up in what we call today Laytown.
That's just up the road.
Laytown Creek was back then called Linville Creek, and you went across, and right, the road goes around the spot just about where the house stood, where Laurie lived. When I lived up there one time, I rented a trailer from a family of Canucks that had lived there since the early 50s, I guess. And Mrs. Canuck told me that when they first moved up there was an old house that had sat about where I was talking about, that had been tore down, and people was using the boards to build on their barns or add to their sheds and stuff. So I guess that house stood for about 90 years after Laurie died. But Tom would see Laurie, and Laurie and Ann had another cousin, and her name was Pauline Foster. Nowadays they would pronounce it either Pearline or Pauline, but back then I-N-E was always Ein. They call her Pauline. And she lived up near Boone, and she come down and stayed with the Meltons at Ann and her man's house. And what she was doing there was she was trying to work to get up enough money to buy some medicine. She was sick with something, and so anyway, before long, Tom got sick with something, and Ann was sick, and Laurie, and they had what the old mountain people called the pock, and there's probably a dozen different names for it, but now we'd call it syphilis. And so Uncle Wade Gilbert's granddaddy was sitting on his porch one day down there, and he said Tom Dooley come by to see him, and said as he walked down below the porch, he said, Tom, he's mad about something. He's sort of talking to himself, and he claimed that he said, I'll kill the so-and-so woman that give me this if it's the last thing I do on earth. And of course, Wade's granddaddy had to tell that in court a year or two later. Well, I don't know who started it. It seems like, in the light of modern evidence, it looks like it might have been Pauline Foster was the one that brought it in there. And somebody was free-hearted and sharing. And anyway, they always were seeing Dr. Carter, who would prescribe them salts of mercury. That was all they had to treat it with back then. And so one morning, it was in May, about the time they'd been dropping corn to plant, Laurie Foster's mother that lived up here at Laytown, he said that he heard Tom outside the window of the house one morning before daylight talking to Laurie, whispering to him, and her back to him. When he finally fell off asleep. When he got up, his mare was gone, and Laurie was too. Well, the last person that ever saw Laurie alive was an old granny woman. For those of you that don't know, a granny woman is a midwife. Of course, a lot of people had to do some of that, even if that wasn't their profession back in them times. But anyway, they called her Aunt Appeline. She had been a slave before the Civil War, and that's probably why she was never called to come to court. They wouldn't have took her word in court. But she said that Laurie Foster rode up by her house. They had fences that went around the yards in them days. Cattle used to roam free, and so you'd have to protect your yard. And they didn't have grass. They'd have plants and flowers and stuff, and put planks down when the muddy weather came to get to the door. But there'd be a paling fence around the yard, and she said that Laurie rode up beside the paling fence, and Aunt Appeline said, "Where you going, Laurie?" And she said, I'm going to get married. And she said, who are you going to marry? And she said, I'm going to marry Tom Dooley. And she rode on off up the hill. The wind was blowing in her hair, and that was the last anybody ever saw of it. So it wasn't long till her daddy got to hunting for his mare. You'd have thought he went to hunting for her first, but he was real worried about his horse. And they started looking for her. And they looked all around. And back then, all the land down through Happy Valley was owned by 2 or 3 families that had plantations, and most of them had been colonels and stuff during the war between the states. And so I can't remember now. It was Davy Horton's bunch. He worked a group of men for a posse, and they was down there in Wilkes hunting, and they come to a place where the horses had shy back out of. So they sent some young boys out in the woods with sticks to job the ground with, and they jobbed around on the ground, and they found an article of clothes, and they got to digging a little deeper, and they found a body in there, and that's where Laurie was buried. They call that the Laurie Ridge now, or they did when I was growing up. It might have some other name now. They said that she was buried in a grave 3 foot long and 4 foot deep, or 4 foot long, 3 foot deep, I forgot which. Her limbs had been drawed up. She's just sort of hunched down in there, and her clothes had been folded and put over her, and then dirt and sticks and leaves put over that. And so it was known that she was Tom Dooley's girlfriend, and allegedly she's to have married him. So they got to searching for Tom. Well, Tom had already left Wilkes County, and he had went up Elk Creek and across the mountain above Triplet and over to Meat Camp, and then crossed over by on the edge of Snake Mountain and come out and trade, and went down to into Johnson County, Tennessee, where he had worked for a man by the name of Colonel James Grayson, I believe it was. And at the time that the deputies went to find him, they hadn't discovered Laurie's body yet, but they did before they got home. But anyway, nowadays there'd been so many loopholes, I don't reckon the case had ever been solved any more than it was then. They stopped at Grayson's house and asked him described Tom to him, and he said yes, said he'd been there. He'd worked for a week or 2. He was trying to buy clothes. His shoes was about wore out. He was wanting some boots, I think. And he had just left either that morning or the day before, something like that. But he believed that he could lead them to him. And so they went till they come down to, what's the name of that creek, Doug?
Gentry's Creek.
Is that where they found him?
Yeah. Doe Creek?
Is
it Doe Creek?
It's close to Doe Creek, ain't it?
Gentry's Creek.
And they seen him down in the water, washing his feet off. Guess he's going to put his boots back on. And they got the drop on him. And so they tied him up and brought him back across the mountain to Wilkes County. And they had a trial. The first trial was had in Wilkesboro. And the law put out the word that if anybody that knowed anything about the murder, if they had something to do with it, they'd be set free if they would turn state's evidence on the perpetrators of Laurie Foster's murder. And so they said that Tom's mother rid a mule, and Pauline Foster had a horse, and she jumped on the horse and they had a race down the river road to see who'd get to Wilkesboro first. And Pauline beat Mrs. Dooley. And so she turned state's evidence. She said that Ann took her up on the mountain that night and left her sitting on a log. And she said, "You wait here." And she went off up the hill and was gone for a time. And then finally, about the time Pauline was about to give out a setting there, she heard something and seen them a-coming. It was Ann and Tom Dooley, and they had a pole between their shoulders. And on the pole was tied up Laurie Foster. And they said they carried her around the mountain and back in the woods and buried her out there. And so that pretty much put them on the hot plate. And I don't remember what the reason that the first trial failed. If they got the jury got jammed up or what. But anyway, they had to have a second trial. And they bound it over to court in Statesville. It was the federal courthouse, I guess. I know it used to be back in the 80s. They had his second trial down there, and they got Governor Zebulon Vance, or the former Governor Zebulon Vance, to be Tom's lawyer. And he was North Carolina's famous Civil War governor. But he went to practicing law after the war was over. It was just about 2 years or less after the war ended. But he didn't do such a good job because he didn't get Tom out of it. And they had Ann in court in a jail at Statesville, in the old jailhouse down there. And the judge sentenced Tom to hang him. It was really circumstantial evidence. They didn't have anybody that actually saw the knife go into Laurie to testify. And so, but they found him guilty anyway, and they sentenced to hanging. I think it was in May of 1868. And there's a ridge. It's just on the east side of, maybe it's the southeast side of town of Statesville, where there's bunches of, I guess it's cotton mills there now, or was at one time. But that was the place where they went to hang him. They built a scaffold up, a gallows, and they said that the morning of his hanging that he read in the wagon and sat on his casket and played the fiddle on the way there. And when they pulled up before the scaffold, he looked up at it and seen that rope, and he turned around. They said he claimed that he said, "Well, boys, if I'd have known you was going to use a new rope on me this morning, I'd have washed my neck." Guess that's what they call gallows humor. Anyway, when he got up on the scaffold, they told him he could say something, and they said that he talked to the crowds and admonished them to live a better life than he had and not do wrong, and just what you usually hear in stories like that. But they said the last word that he told them was, he put out his hand and he said, "Gentlemen," he said, "you see this hand? Does it tremble?" He said, "I never heard a hair on the girl's head." And so they had to stop it right there. That was the end of what he had to say. They hung him. And all the official business was done but the hanging, and so he never explained himself or ever told exactly what happened. But they said that when I went up to Fort Defiance one time to do a program, and there's a bunch of kids from, I think it was Gamewell, that came out to watch the festive. There's more stuff going on. what I did, and I told him about Tom Dooley, and after it's over, one of the children, I guess it was one of the children's granddaddies that had come, just to, I guess, not chaperone him, he's too young for that, just came to be with him, I reckon. I was talking to him about it, and he said he growed up down yonder where they all lived at. He said that, and he was pretty old then, he said when his young man that he knowed, one of the old Melton men that lived down there, that I guess he was living at the time that happened, and he told him, he said that Tom Dooley got, that Tom went to meet Laurie Foster, like he said, but when he got there, she was dead already. And so I used to work in Statesville as a visiting artist. I'd tell tales and sing old ballads that people used to sing that told stories. And in the school systems, and one of the schools up in the county, it was between, I can't remember the name of the community, it was between Statesville and Wilkesboro. I went up there to sing, and I happened to tell the tale about Tom Dooley that day. And when I got done, the librarian there at the school, I guess that was around 1983 or 2 or 81. Anyway, it was around 1980, I think. She said that when she was a little girl, that her granddaddy lived with her, and that he was a deputy in Statesville at the time that Tom Dooley was hanged. And she said that when he got old, before he died, his mind went to wandering, he'd see things, and she said he kept saying, he's a-hanging there. Yeah, he's a-hanging. And in his mind's eye, he was looking back to 1868, and he said that he had told him when he was in good health that Tom, when he hung, that he swung a long time before they ever cut him down, and that's the last thing that he saw before he died in his mind's eye was Tom Dooley's body was swinging there. And Tom's sister and his brother-in-law carried his body back down here to Wilkes, and they buried him down there. And I really don't know the answer to why they buried Laurie here. You was telling me about there used to be a sharecropper's home, it said across the field yonder, and they might have had something been related to Laurie. Her daddy lived up at Laytown. I just don't know why she wasn't buried in a cemetery or a graveyard. I guess they couldn't have found a prettier place to bury her.
Maybe she didn't go to church. Up there anyway.
Did she go to church?
She probably didn't go to church at Laytown.
Maybe not. That could might have been here. I don't know if they had a church up there or not back then.
They still got one up there.
Huh?
They still got one up there. They don't use it though.
But anyway, Laurie was buried here, and they said that Ann Melton, but the night before Tom was to hang, he told him at the courthouse or the jailhouse, wherever in Statesville, he said that Ann Melton didn't have anything to do with it. It was all him, which just twisted his word. I mean, he said that his the only one had anything to do with it there. Then when he got up to hang, he said he didn't have anything to do with it. So anyway, they set Ann free on his word. And there was a lot of fellers said that if there'd have been one woman in the jury and Ann had went to trial, said they'd give her first degree. But they claimed that they wasn't a man that would have convicted her, which is kind of hard to believe in the light of some evidence, because there was actually a picture taken of Ann Melton. If you ever want to see it, it's down at Whippoorwill Academy at Ferguson. And I'd waited half my life to see a picture of Ann Melton. I seen it, and my jaw dropped down to my chest. I wouldn't. I'd have hung her just to look at her. That picture, certainly wasn't a good picture. I don't remember if it was one of those old Daguerrean type photos or made with a little different development. But anyway, in her picture, she certainly wasn't anything to write home about. But they claimed that she was really ravishing in her prime. But sometime after that, I guess she must have lived another 15 or so years after that. When she got sick and she went to die. And Uncle Wade said his granny was there. She was one of 2 or 3 women that looked after Ann. And he said that Ann said, now, girls, if I knowed I was going to live, I'd never tell this, but if I knowed that I was about to die, said I've got something on my heart that I need to tell. And they let her rest a minute and went off to another room, and finally they come back in there and they said, well, Ann, they said, you can't live, honey. Said, if there's anything you got to say, we wished you'd go ahead and tell it. And evidently in the meantime she had got so weak she couldn't talk. They said that she just turned her head over. In a few minutes she is gone. And so whatever the truth that she knowed, if she didn't tell some of her children, then what she knew went to the grave with her and buried a long time ago. I don't know how things get started. You know, people always come up with tales about people and made up stuff. They claimed, some of them, that that night that she was dying, that there was meat a-popping. You could hear brimstone and sulfur, and said that black cats was running across the yard outside, and that the black man, the booger man they called him then, was standing at the foot of the bed ready to take her soul when she died. Uncle Wade Gilbert said that they just had his granny and 2 other women there the night she died. But anyway, she passed on, and the story went down into history, and there was a number of verses to it, and then there was a lot of floating verses. You know, a lot of I guess folk poetry like that would get put onto different banjo tunes and songs that accumulated into it and became the song that was later known as Tom Dooley. There's 2 or 3 ways to do it. I've heard at least 4 or 5 tunes to it. I know that Verna Walker, that was lived at Kings Creek, she said that the chorus went, "Oh, bow your head, Tom Dooley. Bow your head and cry," rather than hang down your head, Tom Dooley, like that. But in 1925, I think, or 26, it was recorded by a man they called Blind Grayson, G.B. Grayson, George Lanham Grayson. He lived over near Laura Bloomery in Johnson County, Tennessee, just across the line. And him and Henry Whitter recorded it. And then in 1939, on a field trip to the mountains to learn old ballads, Ann and Frank Warner recorded a man that lived over in Pick Britches singing the song of Tom Dooley. His name was Frank Prophet. And Frank sang it to him, and they took down the words and tune. And about 10 years later, Frank Warner, he gave the ballad of it to Alan Lomax, who was one of the heads of the Smithsonian for folklore and recorded all over the world. He put out a book called Folk Song USA, and they had Tom Dooley in it. And it was about 8 or 9 years after that that one of the Kingston Trio, or either their agent or whoever hunted music up for him, found that, and they arranged it into the song that they recorded and started the hootenanny and the folk festival movement. And it became famous. And years later, they said that Frank Prophet was sitting in his living room when they came out on Ed Sullivan and sang that song. He about had a heart attack. They're singing his song. And so Frank Warner interceded for him, and they finally got an agreement by law that Frank had written their version of it, and that all the royalties after 1962 would go to Frank, and then it went passed on to his wife. But of course it had made all its millions by then. But that's sort of how the story of Tom Dooley got started. And I know when I was growing up in school, lots of my schoolfellows was related to Tom or Laurie or Ann or some of them. But Cliff Brawhill told me when he was a boy, he said if you mentioned Tom Dooley or Ann Melton, said you'd get your face smacked. But you didn't talk about that then. He said when the Kingston Trio put that out, he said everybody in the area was claiming kin to him. They're trying to hang on to the tags of popularity, I reckon. But it was scandalous back for years after that happened. And so I'm going to sing you the way that I learned this from, I guess it was from Rolf Ellison. He was a banjo picker and a fiddler. He was raised up in the Pottertown and Meat Camp section of Watauga County. And I learned lots of old ballads and stories from his family. And this is the old version of Tom Dooley, or one of the old versions. Hang your head, Tom Dooley, oh bow your head and cry. Kill poor Laurie Foster and you know you're bound to die. Better on the mountain, there to be your wife. Met her on the mountain and you stopped her with your knife. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh bow your head and cry. Kill poor Laurie Foster, you know you're bound to die. You dug the grave 4 foot long, you dug it 3 foot deep. You throwed your coat up over her and tromped it with your feet. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh bow your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. In this world and one more, oh where do you reckon I'll be? Way down yonder in a lonesome valley, hanging from a white oak tree. What my mammy told me is about to come to pass. Drinking liquor and bad women would be my ruin at last. Oh, hang your head, Tom Dooley, oh, bow your head and cry. Kill poor Laurie Foster, you know you're bound to die. At this time tomorrow, well, reckon where I'll be. If it hadn't have been for grace, son, I'd been in Tennessee. The tree a being oak, boys, and the rope a being strong. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to be hung. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh, bow your head and cry. Kill poor Laurie Foster, you know you're bound to die.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, that reminds me of something. I might not all tell this. I went to work one morning, had a new pair of shoes on. And they said, hey, Cornette, come back here. And beware of a crowd that calls you in, and they start laughing, you know, they're up to something. I should have just turned around and left. They stepped on my shoes, and I said, hey, sorry, you just stepped on my shoes. And I'm telling you, I had his face slapped before I made it. They took an electric horse and lifted me up, and I had a grease gun, and he let me down. I mean, I just had to say that, sorry. See, that's part of the cornet in me, whether it's a claim to you or not.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it over now to my sister and brother-in-law, Doug Tribbitt and Marina. And Marina's daddy, he was very sensitive to life, and he wrote a lot of songs. He knew a lot of old songs, all old ballads, and banjo tunes, and Carter family numbers, and things like that. But he wrote a lot in that same style. And if there's any more to say about it, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, when we were growing up, instead of going fun places, we'd go to graveyards and places where maybe murders or something happened, which was, well, I guess my dad thought that was fun. So we came to Laurie Foster's grave, and if I'm not mistaken, her grave used to be closer to the creek. Is that right, or do you know?
I don't know.
Because I remember a creek being
I've
behind
never
it.
seen it, but
Somebody tried to steal it.
Maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, so we came, and my dad, while we were standing there looking at the grave, talking about the story and all this, he went home and he wrote a song about it. So I'm going to try to sing that song today. All right, so go.
You ready?
Way down in North Carolina, where the Yadkin River flows, a pretty girl was murdered a long, long time ago. A long, long time ago. Her name was Laurie Foster, a maid of beauty rare, with eyes as bright as heaven, and dark and waving hair, with dark and waving hair. Her boyfriend was Tom Dooley, a wild and reckless kind. He took her out one evening as the stars began to shine, as stars began to shine. He said, I love you, Laurie, you soon will be my wife. Then in her fair young bosom, he plunged that fatal knife. He plunged that fatal knife. There stands her little headstone in marble white as snow, where Laurie sleeps forever as evening breezes blow, as evening breezes blow. The wildflowers are a-blooming around this lonesome mound, where Laurie sleeps forever in that cold and silent ground, in the cold and silent ground. Come all of you young people
sir.
Do you know what this grave is all about here?
That's where Laurie Foster was buried there.
Right there?
Uh-huh.
That's where she is.
Yeah, they
I don't believe it. Let's see.
well, you have to take it up with her then. Yeah, they buried her down here.
This gentleman over here's got a question, Buck.
Okay.
Dula, D-U-L-A.